I was sitting there minding my own business, trying to figure out if I'd left my phone on silent or if I'd just missed an email from a supplier. The usual grind. Then Jordan Kane, CEO of Rocky Mountain Logistics, drops the bomb. "Wes, we're making some changes," he said, his voice all polished and rehearsed like he'd practiced this line in front of a mirror. "We're realigning the organization. I'm Wesley Patterson, 48 years old, and I'd been with this company almost since day one. Helped build it from a startup, really. From a tiny office with a desk that was way too big for the space to a $15 million operation spanning 3 states. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The words weren't, 'You're fired,' but they might as well have been. I was being pushed out, stripped of authority, sidelined under the excuse of realignment. It hit me hard. 20 years of my life. Before that, 8 years in Army logistics, learning supply chain management the hard way in places like Kuwait and Afghanistan. I'd brought that discipline and those relationships here when I joined the company in 2004, back when it was just 3 guys with 2 trucks and big dreams. I didn't even know how to respond at first. All those people in the room, executives, managers, watching, waiting for me to say something. But there was nothing to say. Jordan, the fresh-faced 30-year-old with his shiny Wharton MBA, looked like he had it all figured out, while I was just the guy who actually made the damn thing work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jordan had been hired 8 months ago specifically to modernize operations ahead of the acquisition talks that had been going on with Summit distribution partners. Those talks had started 14 months back, and everyone knew changes were coming. I just didn't expect to be one of them. I didn't shout, didn't fight it. I didn't even make eye contact with anyone as I stood up to grab my stuff. I just kept my head down, walked past the others in the office, and slipped my business card across Jordan's desk without a word. Just a small act, subtle. It was all I could manage. I'd been cut loose from any real authority, but I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Anger, humiliation, confusion. Yeah, they were there, all tangled together in my gut. But I was already thinking about my next move. My mind raced, plotting out how I could use this humiliation to my advantage. That was how I survived in this business after all, by always staying one step ahead. I walked out of that office knowing this wasn't the end for me, not by a long shot. I had 28 years of experience, relationships built over 2 decades, and I understood this company's operations better than anyone. Jordan could have his fancy title. I had something more valuable. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Jennifer, my wife of 22 years. She could tell something was wrong the minute I walked in the door. "What happened?" she asked, setting down her coffee mug. Jordan restructured my position, I said, keeping my voice steady, basically pushed me to the sidelines. Her face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, worry. "What does that mean for us? For the kids' college funds?" That was the question I'd been dreading. Our daughter Emma was a junior at Colorado State, and our son Ryan was starting his senior year of high school. College wasn't cheap, and at 48, I wasn't exactly in prime position to start over somewhere else. "I'm still employed," I said, "still drawing a salary. We'll figure it out." But Jennifer knew me too well. "You have a plan, don't you?" I did. I just couldn't tell her what it was yet. The next week was rough. Jordan didn't waste a second stepping into the role like he'd earned it. The very next Monday after my demotion, he called a meeting without me. Vendor strategy, my territory for 2 decades. I stayed silent, sitting at my desk while the executives filed into the glass-walled conference room. I could see them nodding along while Jordan waved his hands around and clicked through his PowerPoint like he'd unlocked some secret to the universe. Problem was, he didn't know jack about how any of it actually worked. See, I'd spent 20 years building relationships with every major carrier between Denver and Phoenix. I knew which drivers could handle rush deliveries, which companies would cut us deals during slow seasons, and which routes to avoid during winter storms. Jordan knew spreadsheets and digital transformation buzzwords. Big difference. I watched him point to a chart showing our vendor costs, talking about streamlining redundancies. What he was really saying was he wanted to cut our backup suppliers to save money. Those backup suppliers had saved our ass more times than I could count. When Mountain West Transport, our primary Phoenix route, had that truck fire outside Flagstaff last year, it was our backup relationship with Desert Express that kept us from losing the Morrison manufacturing contract. But Jordan couldn't see that far ahead. He was looking at quarterly numbers, not the relationships that took years to build. The office started to feel different, tighter, quieter. People kept their heads down more. Sarah from dispatching gave me a look that said she knew this was wrong. Mike from warehouse logistics just shook his head when Jordan walked past. Morale dipped, but nobody said it out loud. Jordan strutted around like things were fine, but the rhythm was off, like a truck driving with one tire half flat. I could feel the weight of every missed beat. These were people I'd hired, trained, worked with for years. Now they were stuck watching someone who didn't understand the first thing about what we did. I'd always made it a point to know everyone's name in this company, not just the executives, but the warehouse guys, the dispatchers, the mechanics. I knew that Rodriguez had a kid with special needs, that Thompson was saving up for his daughter's wedding, that Kelly was working nights to finish her logistics degree. That's how you build a team. That's how you build loyalty. Jordan saw employees as cost centers and efficiency metrics. I saw them as the people who made this company work. Then, out of nowhere, I got an email that changed everything. It was addressed directly to me from a guy named Ryan Torres at Summit Distribution Partners. Hi, Wes. I'm working on behalf of Summit to get clarity on some operational workflows that appear undocumented, hoping you can provide insight into how freight scheduling and vendor redundancies were managed prior to the current transition. I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair. Summit was doing due diligence, and somehow they'd figured out that the real operational knowledge wasn't sitting in Jordan's corner office. It was sitting right here at my desk. I waited 5 hours before I answered. Didn't want it to look desperate. I kept the tone dry, factual, laid out our cross-routing protocols, our tiered supplier system, and how we balanced regional carriers against national ones during peak disruptions. Nothing flashy, just what worked. I explained how we'd built redundancy into every major route. Denver to Phoenix had 3 primary carriers and 2 emergency backups. Denver to Salt Lake had 4 options depending on cargo type and timing. These weren't just vendor lists. They were relationships built over years, tested during crises, refined through experience. Next morning, Ryan replied, "Thanks, Wes. Very helpful. Would appreciate staying in touch as we continue due diligence." No one in the office knew about this email. Not Jordan, not his new crew, not even the finance team. But I knew Summit was already watching, and they weren't impressed with what they were seeing from the corner office. Jordan could run his little show, flash his new branding decks, play CEO. I'd helped build this engine. I still knew how to keep it running with or without the title. The more Jordan floundered over the next 6 weeks, the more Summit started paying attention to what I was quietly doing behind the scenes. It wasn't like I was planning anything major or making a grand gesture. I wasn't out to steal anyone's thunder. I just knew how to fix things, and I was good at it. The emails from Ryan kept coming. Little things at first. Follow-up questions about vendor management, risk assessments on certain shipping routes, stuff that Jordan had ignored or didn't even know about. I gave him what he needed. No fanfare, no drama, just facts, like when he asked about our winter contingency plans. Jordan didn't even know we had any. Every year since 2009, after that massive storm shut down I-70 for 3 days, I'd maintained agreements with 4 different carriers who could reroute through southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Cost us an extra 12 hours and about 15% more in fuel, but it kept freight moving when the interstate was a parking lot. Jordan, meanwhile, was off making waves with his rebranding campaign. He seemed to think flashy logos and new slogans would somehow fix the supply chain issues, but he couldn't see the cracks. Hell, he didn't even know where to look. I started getting calls from drivers and dispatchers I'd worked with for years. Tommy Richardson from Mountain West called me directly one Tuesday morning. "Wes, what the hell's going on over there? Your new guy's trying to renegotiate our contract. Wants to cut our standby rates by 30%. You know we can't do that and maintain the emergency response you need." I knew exactly what Jordan was doing. He was looking at our vendor agreements and seeing dollar signs, not understanding that those standby rates were what kept our backup carriers available when we needed them most. It was like canceling your insurance because you hadn't had a claim in 2 years. "I'll handle it, Tommy," I told him. "Keep doing what you're doing." But I couldn't handle it. Not officially. So I did what I'd learned in the Army. I documented everything. Every conversation, every vendor, every concern, every risk Jordan was creating. And I started sending those reports to Summit's risk assessment team through Ryan. I wasn't trying to sabotage anyone. I was trying to save the company from someone who was about to drive it into a ditch. Jennifer noticed I was working later, staying up on my laptop after dinner. One night, she sat down next to me at the kitchen table while I was typing up another incident report. "You're documenting everything, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Someone has to, I replied. Jordan's making decisions that could sink us. Is this about the merger? I looked at my wife of 22 years. She'd been through enough military moves and career changes to know when I was in strategic mode. Summit's been asking the right questions. They want to know how things really work, not how Jordan thinks they should work. And you're the one with the answers. I'm the one with 20 years of relationships and institutional knowledge. Jordan's got PowerPoint slides. She squeezed my shoulder. Just don't let it consume you, Wes. I know how you get when you're protecting something you built. She was right. I did get protective. But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Sarah in dispatching, who Jordan had already threatened to replace with an automated system. This was about Mike in warehousing, who'd worked here since we only had one facility. This was about all the relationships with vendors, customers, and employees that had taken 2 decades to build. Then one day out of nowhere, I got an email from a woman named Jessica at Summit. She was the integration specialist for the merger, and she wanted to talk about operational continuity. She attached a confidential file with the subject line Leadership Transition Framework. I clicked it open, expecting another round of vendor reports or logistics updates. Instead, I saw my name listed as Continuity Lead underlined in the organizational chart. I leaned back in my chair reading through it again, Continuity Lead. My role was to ensure that operations ran smoothly during the acquisition process, with authority over all operational decisions during the transition period. There it was, plain as day. Summit had been watching, evaluating, and they'd already made their decision about who they trusted to keep the company running. I didn't say a word to anyone. I didn't need to. Jordan was still focused on rebranding and restructuring, thinking that was the big win. I had bigger plans brewing. I kept a low profile. Didn't even bring it up to Jessica when we exchanged emails about operational assessments. I wasn't trying to make headlines or get attention. I just wanted to keep things running like they used to, keep the wheels turning without anyone noticing the grease, but Jordan was making that harder every week. His latest cost-saving initiative was cutting our vendor redundancies across the board. He'd identified what he called duplicate relationships, basically any carrier we paid retainer fees to as backup coverage. In his mind, we were throwing money away paying for services we didn't use every month. To me, those retainer fees were the difference between delivering on time and explaining to customers why their freight was sitting in a snowbank on I-25. It's basic efficiency, Jordan explained to the leadership team in one of his presentations. We're paying these carriers to sit around doing nothing 80% of the time. That's not sustainable business practice. What Jordan didn't understand was that those carriers weren't doing nothing. They were available. When Penske broke down outside Grand Junction with a load of medical equipment bound for Phoenix, we had Desert Express rolling within 2 hours because of that retainer relationship. When that flash flood washed out the highway through Moab, our backup route through Durango was already lined up and ready. But you can't put availability on a spreadsheet. You can't quantify relationships, and you definitely can't explain the value of 20 years of trust to someone who thinks business is just about quarterly numbers. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. We had a major shipment of computer components headed from Denver to Las Vegas, high value, time-sensitive, critical for a product launch. Our primary carrier, Southwest Freight, had a mechanical breakdown just outside Rifle. In the old system, I would have called Jerry at Mountain Express, and that load would have been transferred and rolling again within 4 hours. But Jordan had terminated our standby agreement with Mountain Express the week before. Redundant cost structure, he called it. So instead of a 4-hour delay, we had a 2-day delay while Southwest scrambled to get another truck from their Denver hub. The customer, Apex Technologies, was furious. They'd been working with us for 8 years, and this was the first time we'd ever let them down. I got a call from their logistics director, Maria Santos, at 6:30 in the morning. Wes, what happened? This isn't like you guys. I couldn't tell her the truth, that our new CEO had eliminated the backup plan to save $3,000 a month. Instead, I told her we were experiencing some operational adjustments and assured her it wouldn't happen again. But I knew it would. Jordan's efficiency improvements were setting us up for failure, one canceled backup plan at a time. That afternoon, I wrote the most detailed operational risk assessment I'd ever put together. I outlined every vulnerability Jordan's cuts had created, every relationship that was now strained, every future crisis we were no longer prepared to handle. I documented the Apex Technologies delay, the vendor complaints, and the employee morale issues that were starting to affect performance. Then I did something Jordan would never have thought to do. I sent it directly to Summit's risk management team. Not through Ryan, not through Jessica, but straight to the people whose job it was to evaluate operational threats to their investment. No emotion, no finger pointing, just facts. Clear, documented facts about what was happening to the company they were about to spend $50 million to acquire. I knew it would get noticed. What I didn't know was how quickly things were about to change. It didn't take long. A few days later, I got an email from Jessica that changed everything. "Hi, Wes. I've reviewed your recent operational risk assessment and would appreciate your insight on how these changes might impact long-term viability. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the transition framework going forward." I didn't hesitate. I wrote up a detailed response explaining exactly how Jordan's cuts were creating systemic vulnerabilities. I didn't have to sugarcoat anything. The gaps were obvious to anyone who understood logistics operations. The company was teetering, and Jordan's strategy wasn't going to hold. I wasn't interested in making Jordan look bad. The facts did that just fine. I just wanted to make sure the right people had the information they needed to protect their investment. The more I interacted with Jessica over the following weeks, the more I understood that Summit was already sizing me up. I was becoming the expert they needed to keep the company from falling apart. The guy in the background fixing everything quietly while Jordan took the spotlight. Meanwhile, Jordan was busy making his biggest mistake yet. He decided to completely overhaul our driver management system, bringing in some consultant from Silicon Valley who promised to revolutionize logistics through AI-driven optimization. What that meant in practice was firing our most experienced dispatchers and replacing them with an algorithm that didn't understand the first thing about weather patterns, driver personalities, or customer relationships. Rodriguez, our lead dispatcher, had been with us for 12 years. He knew every driver in our network personally. He knew which ones could handle the mountain passes in winter, which ones worked best with difficult customers, which ones could be counted on for emergency runs. The new system saw drivers as interchangeable units with efficiency ratings. "They're letting me go Friday," Rodriguez told me one morning, stopping by my desk with that look people get when their world's been turned upside down. "What's the severance like?" I asked. 2 weeks, after 12 years. He shook his head. "Jordan says the AI system will be more efficient, won't need someone tracking all the personal stuff." I knew this was going to be a disaster. Our drivers weren't just employees, they were partners. They stayed loyal to us because we treated them like human beings, not efficiency metrics. Tommy Richardson had been driving for us for 8 years because Rodriguez always made sure he got home to Albuquerque for his daughter's soccer games. Maria Gonzalez stayed with us through 3 competing job offers because our dispatchers understood her schedule as a single mom. The new system didn't care about any of that. I documented everything. Every violation of our continuity framework, every relationship that was about to be destroyed, every operational risk Jordan was creating, and I sent it all to Summit's integration team. That's when Jordan finally noticed what I was doing. He stormed into my cubicle that afternoon, his face red with frustration. "You're undermining me," he said, trying to keep his voice low but clearly struggling with his anger. "You've been sending reports to Summit behind my back." I stayed calm. I'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. "No, Jordan, I'm documenting operational risks that could impact the acquisition. That's not your job anymore. I restructured your position, remember? Summit designated me as continuity lead. Check your merger documentation." His eyes flashed with something between confusion and rage. He clearly hadn't read the fine print of Summit's integration framework. "I'm the CEO. All operational decisions go through me." "Not during the transition period," I said quietly. "Summit's been very clear about that." He stood there for a moment, probably realizing for the first time that he wasn't as in control as he thought. Then he turned and walked back to his office, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. The next morning I got a call from Preston Green, Summit's CEO. It was brief, but it told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to play out. "Wes, we're accelerating the final integration meeting. I'd like you to prepare a comprehensive operational assessment for the board review next Tuesday." "Of course, Mr. Green. Should I coordinate with Jordan on the presentation?" There was a pause. "That won't be necessary. We'll handle the coordination from our end." That Friday, Summit announced they were freezing all staffing changes at Rocky Mountain Logistics pending final integration review. Every one of Jordan's proposed changes was on hold. The AI dispatcher system, the vendor cuts, the employee terminations, everything stopped. Jordan had no idea what had just happened. I knew exactly what had just happened. Over the weekend, I prepared the most comprehensive operational report of my career. I laid out every system, every relationship, every contingency plan that made Rocky Mountain Logistics work. I explained the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, between cost-cutting and value preservation. Most importantly, I documented exactly what would happen if Jordan's changes went through. Not opinions or predictions, but factual analysis based on 20 years of experience and 8 months of watching his decisions play out. Jennifer found me at the kitchen table Sunday night, still working on the presentation. "Big week ahead?" she asked, sitting down with her tea. "The biggest," I said. "Tuesday's the day everything gets decided." "Are you nervous?" I thought about that. "No, I'm prepared." She smiled. That's my military man talking. Tuesday morning came, faster than I expected. I walked into the conference room knowing this was the meeting where it would all come together. Rocky Mountain Logistics and Summit had been circling each other for over a year, and today the transition would finally happen. The room was set up in that sterile corporate way with the long mahogany table and leather chairs. Jordan was already standing at the front, clicking through his flashy PowerPoint slides. His voice was high energy, too eager as he pitched his vision for the company's future under Summit's ownership. He talked about growth, about innovation, about the bright new direction he was leading us toward. The slides were all graphs and colorful charts, each one more optimistic than the last. Digital transformation, automated systems, streamlined operations. It looked impressive, but it was smoke and mirrors. I sat quietly in my usual spot along the wall, arms crossed, waiting for him to finish. Jordan's confidence was all bravado. He wasn't talking about the real problems, the ones I had been fixing in the shadows for months. He wasn't talking about the relationships he'd destroyed or the operational risks he'd created. And he wasn't mentioning that behind the scenes, Summit had already started to take control. Jordan finished his presentation to polite applause, and the room fell into that corporate silence where everyone's waiting to see what happens next. Jessica from Summit began reviewing the operational continuity plans, outlining the systems that would keep things running smoothly post-acquisition. She was methodical, professional, going through each department and explaining how the integration would proceed. Before she could finish, though, Preston Green, Summit's CEO, looked directly at me. His gaze was steady, calculating. "Wes," he said, his voice cutting through the corporate politeness, "can you clarify whether the organizational changes Jordan has proposed align with the operational continuity framework we've established?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I didn't hesitate. I didn't need to. I slid my business card across the table to Preston. It was a simple move. No fanfare, no words, just the card, my name, my role as continuity lead, and Summit's logo printed right there in corporate blue. The room went completely silent. The silence was thick, heavy, the kind that makes everyone in the room hold their breath. Jordan started to laugh, nervous at first, like he was trying to brush it off, like he didn't feel the shift in the air. "It's just a formality, right?" he said, his voice a little too high-pitched, a little too forced. "We're just finalizing the operational transition plan." Preston didn't laugh. He picked up the card, glanced at it, and looked down at the document in front of him. His eyes skimmed the lines, then locked onto the legal language that spelled out exactly what Summit had been planning all along. Slowly, he looked back at the room. "I see," Preston said, his voice calm but firm. "According to the continuity framework established in our merger agreement, all operational and staffing decisions during the transition period fall under Wes's authority as continuity lead. That includes the organizational changes Jordan has proposed." The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with the weight of his words. I felt the shift, but I kept my face neutral. Jordan, on the other hand, looked like the floor had dropped out from under him. His bravado crumbled in an instant. He stared at Preston, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the right words. This can't be right," Jordan stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm the CEO. I'm the one who's been leading this company through the acquisition process." Preston's eyes didn't waver. "The framework was established 6 months ago, Jordan. Summit needed assurance that operational continuity would be maintained regardless of leadership transitions. Wes has been our designated as..." point of contact for all operational matters since then. I could see the pieces falling into place in Jordan's mind. All those emails I'd been sending to Summit, all those operational reports, all those risk assessments he'd dismissed as undermining his authority. They weren't undermining anything. They were exactly what Summit had asked me to provide. Jessica opened her folder and pulled out another document. We've reviewed the comprehensive operational assessment Wes provided, along with his documentation of the risks associated with the proposed changes. Based on that analysis, Summit has decided to implement a different integration strategy. Jordan's face went from red to a sickly shade of gray. What kind of different strategy? Preston cleared his throat, and I knew this was the moment Jordan's world was about to change completely. We're restructuring the leadership team effective immediately. You'll be reassigned to oversee warehouse operations in our Tucson facility. It's a vital role, but one that will allow you to gain more hands-on operational experience. The words hit Jordan like physical blows. CEO to warehouse manager, corner office to loading dock, strategic planning to inventory management. He tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the panic creeping into his eyes. For how long? He managed to ask. That will depend on performance and operational improvement in the Tucson facility, Jessica said diplomatically. We see it as an opportunity for you to develop a deeper understanding of ground-level logistics operations. What she didn't say, but everyone in the room understood, was that Jordan was being exiled. Tucson was 500 miles from Denver, far from corporate headquarters, far from the boardroom, far from any real influence over company strategy. Jordan turned to look at me, his eyes now filled with something between rage and desperation. You planned this all along, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been working against me. From the beginning. I didn't flinch. I'd been expecting this accusation since the moment I started documenting his mistakes. No, Jordan, I said, my voice steady and calm. I prepared for the possibility that your changes might not align with operational reality. Summit needed someone who understood how this company actually works. The finality in my tone seemed to cut right through him. He opened his mouth to say something else, but stopped, probably realizing there was nothing left to say. The decision had been made. His authority was gone. His vision for the company was dead. Preston addressed the room. Wes will assume the role of Vice President of Operations and Continuity, with full operational authority during the integration period and beyond. All department heads will report to him effective immediately. I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't about personal victory. This was about saving the company I'd helped build for 20 years. Jordan stood up slowly, gathering his presentation materials with shaking hands. He looked around the room one more time, probably hoping someone would object, someone would defend him, someone would say this was all a mistake. No one did. He turned and walked out without another word, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I could hear his footsteps echoing down the hallway, getting fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. After Jordan left, the atmosphere in the room immediately lightened. Preston spent the next hour going over Summit's actual integration plans that preserved our vendor relationships, maintained our experienced staff, and built on the operational strengths that had made Rocky Mountain Logistics successful in the first place. Everything I'd been documenting, everything I'd been protecting, everything Jordan had tried to tear down, it was all going to be preserved and improved upon. The AI dispatcher system was scrapped. Rodriguez and the other terminated employees were offered their positions back. Our vendor agreements were restored. Jessica walked me through my new responsibilities. I wouldn't just be maintaining operations. I'd be expanding them. Summit had plans to grow our Colorado operations and establish new routes into Utah and Nevada. They wanted someone who understood relationships, who valued experience, who could build sustainable growth instead of just cutting costs. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in what used to be Jordan's office, reviewing expansion plans with our renewed vendor partners. Tommy Richardson was back to his regular roots. Mountain Express had signed a new 3-year agreement. Apex Technologies was not only continuing their contract but expanding it to include their Salt Lake City distribution center. Rodriguez was back at his dispatcher desk, matching drivers with routes based on 12 years of knowledge about what actually worked in the real world. That evening, I drove home to Jennifer, who was waiting in the kitchen as always. "How was your first day as VP?" she asked, smiling. I thought about everything that had happened. The months of documentation, the careful relationship building with Summit, the patient preparation for this moment. All those late nights at the kitchen table, all those risk assessments, all those emails to Jessica and Ryan. Good, I said, and this time I meant it completely. Really good. Jennifer hugged me, and I could feel the relief in her embrace. We'd weathered the storm. The kids' college funds were secure. My career wasn't ending at 48. It was entering its most important phase. As for Jordan, I heard through the logistics network that he lasted exactly 6 months in Tucson before deciding that warehouse management wasn't for him. He left logistics entirely and went into consulting, probably telling other companies how to optimize their operations based on his extensive 8 months of CEO experience. I hope he learned something from those months loading trucks and managing inventory. Maybe he finally understood the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, between cost-cutting and value creation. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I had a company to run, relationships to rebuild, and a future to plan. 20 years of experience had finally been recognized for what it was worth, and it was worth everything.